honor, duty, glory, and commitment. In today's episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive, we're going to be covering yet another part of the Cyratin military, specifically the Cyratin Royal Army. Now, before we actually get into it, I do want to apologize. This video is obviously late, mainly because Monday came around and I forgot to record the video. And then Tuesday came around, and I even put a note in my calendar to record Tuesday night and have it published as quickly as possible. And I missed the notification, so it is currently Wednesday night. I am now recording it. And so, yeah. Sit back, relax, grab a drink, grab a snack, get comfortable. This one will probably be an average length one. So as I said before, our topic for today is the Cyratin Royal Army. Basically, this is the standard armed forces of the Cyratin military. You know, you have the equivalent of, we're going to base this off of the United States. You have the U.S. Navy, which is the Cyratin Navy, only instead of in the water, it's in the void. You have the United States Marines Corps, which is basically the Cyratin super soldiers. You have the Air Force, which is largely wrapped into the Navy, largely due to the fact these are already ships that are traveling through the void of space. And then you have the Army, which is the Cyratin Royal Army. Now, the Royal Army itself has two primary branches, I guess is a good way to put it. And this is the Cyratin Royal Army proper, as well as something known as the Scarlet Legions. Now, we're going to cover the Scarlet Legions first, and then we'll actually go to the Cyratin Royal Army proper. So, when there is war on any planet within the Cyratin Empire, and there is an overwhelming amount of casualties, the survivors are obviously going to be grieving. They've lost a lot of their family, probably all of their friends, all of their loved ones, everybody that they care about. As you can imagine, this can really mess a person up. Well, for some people, it ends up going into depression, denial, and any of the other steps that are accompanied with that. In other cases, it gives rise to a vigilante-style militia. And these militias are officially known as the Scarlet Legions. Now, the Scarlet Legions aren't officially recognized, nor are they sanctioned by the Cyratin Empire, let alone the Cyratin military. That being said, the Cyratin military has absolutely no problem with feeding them information. Now, an important thing to know about the Scarlet Legions is this. They largely only form after a massive amount of casualties on a planetary scale. You know, Scarlet Legions themselves are extremely rare. And this is oftentimes because they only really truly pop up when it is a planetary war. And they win, but the survivors win by the skin of their teeth, you know? And even then, it's very uncommon. I'm not going to say rare, but it is uncommon for Scarlet Legions to form. Now, within the Scarlet Legion proper, there's two different versions of this. There are the Scarlet Legions, which are basically civilians that gather whatever quote-unquote wartime equipment that they can possibly gain access to, and basically just go on a war path to try and find the people who absolutely annihilated their homeworld and deal as much damage as possible. The other one is known as Scarlet Worlds, and we'll get into them in a little bit. So, as I said with Scarlet Legions, it's the survivors that have decided that they need to get payback. They need to pay back the enemy by any means necessary. And as a result, people who join Scarlet Legions are oftentimes people who quite literally have nothing left to lose. The only thing that they have left to lose is their own life, and typically people who actively participate in Scarlet Legions, they usually don't care, you know? The only thing that they want is vengeance for those that they cared about, for those family members, those friends, whoever it may be that fell in that battle. And as a result, they'll oftentimes loot, as gruesome as this is, they'll oftentimes loot the corpses of fallen soldiers, whether those be Cyratin soldiers or they be non-Cyratin soldiers. When it comes to the Cyratin Empire, well, the wider Cyratin Empire, I wouldn't say that they're really a prideful race. I mean, obviously they are, but they are very against the idea of pillaging supplies, weapons, and armor from the corpses of the fallen, especially if it's enemies. You know? And this largely has... The reasoning behind this is because the Cyratin Empire, they know that their technology is more advanced. Like, if they have a big war with, say, humanity, and this type of situation happens, the soldiers, if they're super desperate, they might gather ammunition from enemy corpses, but they're not going to be taking armor, and they're not going to be taking weapons. They might take more tactical resources, such as things like grenades and stuff like that, but they're not going to take the armor and the weapons. Scarlet Legions, on the other hand, have no qualms about this. They will use whatever they can get their hands on. Now, as I had said before, the Scarlet Legions aren't recognized as an official part of the Cyratin military or the Cyratin Empire. As a result, anything that is, shall we say, waving the banner of the Cyratin Empire, they're not allowed to intervene. But there are a few workarounds. The Cyratin military can't give them weapons. They can't give them armor. They cannot assist Scarlet Legions in any way. But what they can do is feed them information. Information is not counted as assisting them too much, because at the end of the day, when it comes to the military, it's oftentimes, hey, you know those guys who did a right proper job on obliterating your planet? Yeah, it turns out we know the exact location of these guys. Here you go. Go have fun. And that's exactly what they do. Like I said, they go on a warpath and they try and find whoever wronged them. That is, unless you have a very, very unique circumstance known as the Scarlet Worlds. Within the Cyratin Empire, which, keep in mind, everything that we're describing is prior to the Ruin War. So prior to the Ruin War, there were a total of 3 Scarlet Worlds. And the important thing to remember is that Scarlet Legions are about as close as you can get to nomadic as possible. You know, they commandeer whatever supplies they can, they commandeer whatever ships they can, and they just go, and they don't look back. And oftentimes, they will not stop until everybody drops dead. And hopefully, their target is dead as well. Scarlet Worlds, on the other hand, have quite literally dedicated their entire planet's resources towards this vendetta. And typically, Scarlet Worlds can actually form when the original assailants have been dealt with. At that point, they got their vengeance, but now, how best do I want to say this? It's not quite like they got a taste for blood and now they want more, metaphorically. But when it comes to Cyratin Worlds, much like in Warhammer 40k, there is a tithe that has to be paid. Basically taxes. And depending on the planet, will depend on what the taxes are. For certain agri-worlds, the taxes is usually food, crops. For industrial worlds, it's oftentimes various different consumer goods, or maybe more of like supplies for war, If it's like a glitter world, oftentimes it's monetary. And then you have planets that prove to be either naturally incredibly disciplined or a natural place that is very dangerous to live. And their tithe can be soldiers that are fed to the Royal Cyratin Army, or the Cyratin Royal Army, rather. And so these Scarlet Worlds are basically that last form of tithe. These are planets that are oftentimes heavily militarized with whatever they can get their hands on, and then they train generation after generation of soldiers for the sole purpose of relentlessly hunting down the enemy, no matter the cost. But the problem is that, like I said, these worlds are no longer recognized by the Cyratin Empire. They can be in the Cyratin Empire's territory. There's nothing against that. And it's not like the Imperium of Man, Like a great example of this was Krieg. The planetary governor of Krieg had decided that he was going to abstain from the wider Imperium of Man, and, well, we know how that went down. What was it, like a 500-year civil war or some crazy shit like that? By and large, when a world in 40K chooses to leave the Imperium sends the middle finger gift, basically. Either it's an Inquisitor, a bunch of Inquisitors, or it's Astartes that are sent. And if they refuse to get the fuck back in line, they will just forcibly put them back in line, shall we say. The Cyratin Empire doesn't do this. Whilst, yes, it is technically a loss, especially if that planet was providing monetary or agricultural tithes, it's like taking a syringe and taking a few milliliters of water out of a bucket. The fact of the matter is that one planet is a drop of water in the bucket, Yes, you no longer have tithes coming in from that planet, but you have so many tithes coming in from so many other sources. As long as they're not constantly popping up, the Cyratin Empire honestly doesn't care. Because, like I said, prior to the Ruin War, there were 3 of them. 3 planets that left the Cyratin Empire. Well, they didn't leave the Cyratin Empire. They became Scarlet Worlds and were no longer recognized as being part of the Cyratin Empire. Now, of course, these are still Cyratins. These are still people who, at one point, were part of the Cyratin Empire. And it just so happens that these planets were deep within Cyratin territory. So as a result, the Cyratin Empire is protecting their own territory. They are indirectly protecting the Scarlet Worlds as well. They can't directly assist them. If the Scarlet World were to become invaded by the enemies, the Cyratin military cannot intervene under any circumstances, unless it is threatening planets in that solar system that are still part of the Cyratin Empire. But even then, the Navy is restricted to defending those planets rather than actively attacking the fleet that is messing around with the Scarlet World. If the fleet decides that the Scarlet World isn't worth it anymore and starts attacking a different planet, then the Cyratin Navy can go whole hog on them and just beat the ever-living shit out of them, because they're in the middle of Cyratin Hill territory. It's idiotic to go there and start a fight. But so long as the main elements of the fleet are attacking the Scarlet World, the Navy really can't get involved. They can defend the planet that they're around, so long as it's not a Scarlet World, but that's about as far as it can go. However, if there is a fleet that their intention is to attack the Scarlet World, but they haven't arrived yet, and the Cyratin Empire discovers them, there's nothing saying that the Navy can't intervene, that they can't intercept this fleet. Because as far as they know, this fleet could be going anywhere. And having enemies within your territory, as you can probably imagine, isn't exactly the best of situations. Now, what is the primary difference between a Scarlet Legion and a Scarlet World? Scarlet Legions are oftentimes the survivors of a planet that, like I said, go on a war path and they abandon their world, and it's basically like a crusade. You keep on going, you keep on fighting until the last man falls. And after that, the Scarlet Legion is gone because there's nobody else to hold up the banner. Scarlet Worlds, on the other hand, are planets that constantly produce Scarlet Legions that are then sent out. And like I said, it eventually gets to the point where their original aggressors have been dealt with. Either the group that originally attacked them is abolished, they end up dying of old age, or they end up getting taken out by the Scarlet World's Scarlet Legions. At that point, they basically just relentlessly hunt down any enemies of the Cyratin Empire, and it's the exact same way. The soldiers that they're sending out there, they're all volunteers. They're very well aware that once you leave this planet, that's kind of it. Technically, you can return whenever you want, but the usual expectation is you'll stand by the rest of the Scarlet Legion and you'll fight to the last man. You know, it's very rare for a formed Scarlet Legion to return to a Scarlet World. Now, here's the interesting thing. These Scarlet Worlds and these Scarlet Legions can sometimes gain access to proper Cyratin military tech. But of course, you might be wondering, how did they get their hands on this? If the military can't directly intervene in the form of assisting them, which also includes giving them weapons and armor, how do they get the stuff? Especially if they're not looting it off of the corpses of fallen soldiers, which typically Scarlet Legions won't want to do because a lot of times those are family members and friends, you know? Well, it turns out, especially if it's a Scarlet World, the Cyratin Empire has an unofficial system known as the Trader Guilds, and you can kind of think of them somewhat similar to rogue traders in the Imperium. They are actual guilds that hold sway over a region of the Cyratin Empire's territory, and these guilds will even go to other factions. You know, when we talked about the Bastillions and their focus on trade, these are the guys that we're talking about. And basically, they're merchants. They buy and sell just about anything to anyone, with very few exceptions. If they can make a profit off of something, they will buy it and they will sell it to whoever the highest bidder is. And so what the Cyratin Empire discovered is that there's a little bit of a loophole. You see, they can't directly assist these Scarlet Worlds and Scarlet Legions, as I've said many times. But what they can do is they can hire a rogue trader, and they can take maybe the last generation of equipment. You know, it's getting kind of old, you know, either faulty equipment or some new brand spanking new type of equipment comes out. So now the ones that they were just using are kind of like hand-me-downs. They'll sell them to these trader guilds. Well, they sometimes recruit a specific trader guild to kind of manage a specific region, which they do. This isn't something that is just for Scarlet Worlds. The Cyratin Empire will oftentimes pay an insane amount of credits in order to have trader guilds specifically and temporarily post up in a random region of the Cyratin Empire. And this is oftentimes to help stimulate the economy in that region. They do it all the time and everywhere. Well, the Cyratin Empire discovered that if they do this, and it just so happens to be in the same region as the Scarlet Worlds, which absolutely will buy any wartime supplies and equipment they possibly can, they can sell the equipment to the Trader Guild, because at that point, they have absolutely no control of where the Trader Guild will sell these supplies, these wartime equipment. Now, that may seem incredibly stupid. You're taking equipment that, granted, yes, it might be a little old, might be the last generation, but it's still military-grade equipment. And you're just selling it to somebody that could then sell it to some random redneck chucklefuck on the outer rim of the Cyratin Empire? That seems incredibly dangerous, don't you think? After all, think of how it's going for America when there's weapons involved. But the thing we need to remember is that the Cyratin Empire are fiercely loyal. Or the Cyratin race is fiercely loyal to the Cyratin Empire. You know, it very much is a utopia. You know, even standard worlds and rim worlds that haven't quite been brought up to the standard of the Cyratin Empire, you know, that level of technology that you find on, say, a glitter world. It's still, even on the crudest, most primitive of rim worlds within the Cyratin Empire's outer rim, they still have certain things that are influenced by the wider Cyratin Empire. What I mean by that is, like, the economy immediately becomes broken. You know, even on the outer rim, the poorest of people can still afford absolutely everything that they need. Food, shelter, clothing. They can afford it all. At all times, basically. You know? And so it really is a utopia. And it's basically the level of sophistication of the planet. The fundamentals are still there. When a planet is brought into the fold of the Cyratin Empire, it's given the fundamental structure. You know, it's given the broken economy, because at this point that's just a constant standard for the Cyratin Empire. It's given manufacturing, or at the very least as much as they possibly can in a specific time span. They're given proper government, they're given militaries, they're assisted with any type of infrastructure that they might need. This even includes agriculture if their planet can support it. And then slowly but surely, these planets, as they get deeper and deeper into certain territory, and more of these trader guilds come to these rim worlds, now probably a standard world, the technological level increases farther and farther. And they start getting more and more of the up-to-date stuff, you know? And eventually, they become glitter worlds. And this is one of the reasons why the Cyratin Empire, they do pay the trader guilds to post up in a specific region, because it stimulates the economy and allows a constant flow of various different technologies and supplies to be sent to these regions of the Cyratin Empire to try and bring them up to, at the very minimum, glitter world level status. They're never going to be core worlds, but that's because core worlds are literally at the core of the Cyratin Empire. But so, long story short, the Cyratin Empire will pay off a trader, and they'll just so happen to be in the region that the Scarlet World is in, and like I said, they have, once they sell this equipment to the trader, they have no control over where it goes. And if it just so happens to go to these Scarlet Worlds, oops, we didn't know. And you can't really slap them on the hand. Because like I said, it's that exact type of situation. You don't know where these goods are going to go. Yes, technically the trader is stationed in a region of space that the Scarlet World is on, but it's up to the discretion of the trader whether or not they're going to, well, trade with the Scarlet World. Now, are they always going to trade with the Scarlet World? Of course. Of course they're always going to trade, because the Scarlet Worlds are always in high demand for this type of technology, for this type of equipment. It's always in extremely high demand. And Scarlet Worlds, somehow, are constantly capable of acquiring credits. They're constantly capable of acquiring funds. So they will buy astonishing amounts of these supplies. But of course, you can't just constantly have the same trader there, because eventually it's like, okay, yeah, at this point you're directly helping them because the trader has been there for so long. So eventually the Cyratin military has to cycle out these traders all the time. But as long as they're doing that, it's considered indirect assistance. They're not directly helping them. Technically, yes, they're getting the equipment, but it's not the military going to the planet and being like, sending down a shuttle. They open up the shuttle bay door and like, hey, you want to buy this shit from us? You know, they're not directly involving themselves with them. So with that all of that out of the way, let's go on to the Cyratin Royal Army proper. The Cyratin Royal Army, as I've said before, is the standard armed forces of the Cyratin Empire. The Cyratin Empire has this really bizarre focus on their navy and their infantry. The Cyratin Empire does possess war vehicles. We've talked about the insanity that is Cyratin war machines, but they do have war vehicles such as like transports and tanks and stuff like that. They have atmospheric craft and stuff like that, but it's not really a very big focus for them. It's primarily the ships that are in the void of space and the infantry that are boots on the ground. That's where the Cyratin Empire focuses. You can say that sounds incredibly stupid and inefficient, and you would be right, but the Cyratin Empire makes it work. So, members of the Cyratin Royal Army are oftentimes unaugmented, volunteer Cyratin people. And their equipment is very good. Now, there's an important distinction that we have to go over, and that's 3 different pieces of equipment: exoskeletons, exosuits, and power armor. Each one is designed for a different purpose. However, 2 of them are relatively the same, these being the 2 exos. And then power armor has a very different purpose. When we're talking about the Cyratin Empire, it's almost exclusively exo equipment. Even Cyratin Marines use exosuits. Now, what is an exoskeleton? Because that's where we need to start off. An exoskeleton is basically a system of hydraulics that is located along the back and arms and legs of an individual. And the main purpose of it is to assist the natural capabilities of the operator. So, let's say without the exosuit or the exoskeleton, the absolute maximum amount of weight that you can lift by yourself is, let's say, 70 pounds. That's fairly average. But if you try to go beyond 70 pounds, you just can't lift it because that's just how your current body is conditioned. However, if you throw on an exoskeleton, suddenly, because of the support that these hydraulics, which Cyratin Empire exoskeletons don't use hydraulics, but you get the point. Suddenly, that goes from 70 pounds all the way up to 160. And it still feels like you're picking up 70 pounds, but it's significantly more because a lot of that extra load is being handled by the exoskeleton. Now, technically, it wouldn't be over double, but you get the idea. You're capable of lifting more weight than you otherwise would be able to because the exoskeleton is assisting you. Now, what is an exosuit? An exosuit is basically an exoskeleton that has armor plates on it. And like I said, the Cyratin Marines use these. They don't use power armor. That being said, the ones the Cyratin Marines use are fashioned in such a way that they might as well be power armor. They are airtight, which means that these exosuits are capable of surviving hard vacuum, i.e. the void of space, in most situations. Exosuits are designed to still provide that enhancement to your natural capabilities while also providing durability, armor, something that can actually protect you while still providing those bonuses. And the important thing is that exoskeletons and exosuits, the majority of the time, whilst they can be mounted with a reactor, they don't need a reactor. They don't need a power source because it's not taking over the natural capabilities of the body and replacing it. It's enhancing and assisting the natural capabilities of the body. The primary force is still the human, or in this case, the Cyratin body. It's only meant to complement and enhance it. Whereas we can now go to power armor. These exclusively have a reactor built into them. Every single suit is capable of surviving hard vacuum. You can basically think of Fallout power armor, or any form of power armor. It is power armor that is designed to take over for the natural capabilities of the operator. At this point, it's not the power armor is assisting you in doing it. It's the power armor is doing this for you. You're still making the actions. You're still the pilot, but all of that weight that you're lifting up, it's purely reliant on the natural servos and hydraulics of the power armor rather than your natural physical body being enhanced by an exoskeleton. And that's an important thing. Now, power armor is almost never used in the Cyratin Empire, and this is largely due to just sheer bulk and weight. What I mean by that is, yes, power armor is naturally capable of... It's capable of handling enough weight to handle its own weight, plus extra on top of it. You know, power armor is extremely heavy. It provides more defensive capabilities than an exoskeleton, let alone an exosuit, but is far more bulky. The advantages and why Cyratin Marines use exosuits rather than power armor is because it doesn't really weigh a whole lot. Furthermore, it doesn't really cut down on their overall flexibility. They're still, for the most part, just as flexible. You know, their movements are unimpeded. Whereas with power armor, it's quite literally like Fallout power armor. I mean, it obviously doesn't look the same, it doesn't function the same way, but it's still, it's very bulky, it's very more utility oriented rather than comfort oriented. And when I say comfort, like I say, I mean like being able to move in ways that your body would naturally be able to move in, you know? And so it's oftentimes only very specific special forces that are in the Cyratin Empire that actually use power armor. For example, the 1st Division of the Cyratin Marines, known as the Praetorian Guard. The armor that they wear is known as the War Tortoise, which is a suit of power armor. In fact, it's power armor that is semi-similar to Fallout, how you can literally open it up and step into it, and then use it. Obviously, again, it's not identical because copyright is a bitch, but you get the general idea. It is power armor. It is taking over for the natural, already insane capabilities of a Cyratin Marine, and basically taking their natural capabilities, copying it, using only itself, and then augmenting that strength by an incredible amount because of just how the power armor functions. Now, of course, why does all of this matter? Why are we describing what exoskeletons, exosuits, and what power armor is? Well, that's because now we can actually get to the equipment of Cyratin Royal Army members. For the most part, like I said, members of the Cyratin Royal Army are unaugmented and they're just basic volunteer soldiers. They receive a lot of training. Fun fact, they actually, when it comes to Scarlet Worlds, they're heavily militarized, but the training that somebody receives when they enter the Royal Cyratin Army is just slightly better. It's a fantastic achievement of the Scarlet Worlds to get as close as they do, but it's just slightly inferior. Now, in actuality, is this really going to matter on the battlefield? No, probably not. It's largely something down to like members of the Cyratin Royal Army may know a couple of extra tactics that the Scarlet Worlds don't. It's something super superficial that honestly probably isn't really going to make that much of a difference on the battlefield. But regardless. And so, a lot of times, members of the Cyratin Royal Army will be equipped with flak armor, which in Shadow Legacies, flak armor is pretty damn good, and then they'll have, directly on top of that flak armor, they'll have an exoskeleton that is mounted on the armor itself. And this allows them to have the natural durability of standard flak armor, which is designed to take some pretty heavy firepower. It can easily take the majority of plasma munitions from humanity. That being said, if we're talking about sustained fire, the armor won't be able to hold up against it. And if we're talking about heavier weapons that humanity has, it largely won't survive that well. But compared to the fact that they're typically fighting humanity, it's pretty damn good armor. Like, they can take a plasma bolt to the chest, which is usually how you want to shoot. You want to shoot for center mass because it's easier. They can take it to the chest, and they can keep on moving. Now, is the chest plate going to survive that well? Probably not. Probably not. Let's be honest. It's literally plasma, but it can take the hit, and honestly, that's kind of the purpose of armor. It's designed to protect you, to keep you from taking a fatal blow. That's the purpose of it. And so, but they also have this exoskeleton on top of that, which increases their overall capabilities. It allows them to run just a little bit faster, allows them to carry a little bit more weight. It just makes them overall better when it comes to combat situations, whatever that may entail. And so, as a result, they don't really require more heavy specialists, like your average Cyratin Royal soldier, whilst usually being outfitted with something like a plasmite or, in exceptionally rare situations, a solstite rifle, it's kind of like in Halo, how, you have the standard guns, but if you find a turret, you can literally rip the fucking turret off and you can just manhandle the damn thing around. You're incredibly slow, you can't sprint. It's kind of the same thing, Your standard soldier within the Cyratin Royal Army, they can handle actual heavy weaponry. But whilst they can, they probably shouldn't, because they don't have the specialist knowledge in order to use it and use it effectively and without hurting themselves or those around them. So they have the physical capabilities to carry something like that, Any giant, bulky, very powerful two-handed weapon, for example, like machine gun turrets in Halo, when Master Chief or somebody picks them up off of like a standing turret, they can literally do that, and anybody can do it. Most people don't, because like I said, they require that specialist knowledge, but they are capable of doing it. And this means that even during situations like, let's say you're in a building and the building blows up and a whole bunch of rubble falls down, and one of your teammates is trapped under the rubble, you don't have to bring in specialist equipment to get the rubble off of him. You can literally, because their strength is enhanced, they can literally just grab the debris and literally just lift it up and get the guy out. They don't require search and rescue teams because they can just do it in the moment. Which, as you can imagine, incredibly useful. That being said, whilst this certainly does increase their overall agility, there are certain things that it simply can't do. Like, Titanfall operators. I forget exactly what they're called because I've never played Titanfall. But Titanfall, the pilots, when you're running around outside of your giant robot, you can kind of like wall run, and you can stick to the wall because I assume probably because of thrusters that are kind of somewhat forcing you against the wall. That type of thing doesn't exist. Technically, you can get that kind of thing on exosuits and even more rare on power armor, But it's very, very, very rare to find anybody that has it, largely because, whilst yes, it allows for a brand new level of mobility, especially as you can see in Titanfall, comparing the AI that I don't believe have that capability compared to the player who does have that capability, it provides a lot of advantages. But at the same time, it's like, whilst yes, it does provide a boon, it's a boon that's only really useful in specific circumstances, such as urban combat. And the majority of wars are fought in a rural setting. So as you can imagine, if it's just fields, or even if you're in a forest, jumping from tree to tree, not only does that require an exceptional amount of skill in something like parkour, which your average Cyratin soldier probably not going to be able to do, but there's not going to be a lot of walls for you to run across, enhancing your mobility. So the majority of the time, whilst theoretically the Cyratin Empire could produce armor that does that kind of thing, it's just not really useful. In a rural setting, would it be useful? Yeah, probably, but is the Cyratin Empire going to dedicate a lot of resources to researching this for something that they probably will only use like 25% of the time? No, probably not. Now, after that, we can talk about their actual equipment, as it's pretty much the same universally. Obviously, you have your specialists, which have different loadouts, but for right this second, we're talking about your standard, your common Joe soldier, non-specialist. They will have, again, full flak armor, oftentimes protecting all of the vital locations, as well as some maybe not quite as vital locations, because again, you're dealing with plasma here. And they'll usually be given a plasmite, in exceptionally rare cases, maybe even a solstite rifle. Now, we've talked about solstite rifles in the past. They're incredibly dangerous. If you decide that you are going to illegally modify one yourself, if you do one thing wrong, you can quite literally nuke the planet, as the power that is in a solstite rifle, if unleashed uncontrollably, can quite literally set the atmosphere on fire, which would quite literally kill the planet, or at the very least, everything that is on the planet. They're exceptionally dangerous, so oftentimes they're only given to more experienced soldiers that you know for a fact they're not going to try and DIY redneck this shit. Typically, they're given plasmite weaponry. Now, plasmite is significantly less dangerous. It's still dangerous, but it's more like personally dangerous. If you fuck around with this thing, it might just explode in your hands, and unless somebody is standing, like, directly next to you, it's not really going to pose a threat to anybody else. It's going to be an energy-based explosion that will probably, as brutal as it sounds, probably blow you into small chunks, but in the wider scene of a massive war, especially if it's a war on a planetary scale, it's basically insignificant, And this is why the Cyratin Empire, whilst it being inferior, absolutely loves using plasmite. Because it's so much safer, And technically, whilst they shouldn't do this, they're easier and safer to DIY them. If your rifle suffers some damage, you don't have legal spare parts to repair it with, you can kind of jury-rig the damn thing, and it'll more or less work. It's far easier to do it without, the damn thing exploding, or, in the case of a solstite rifle, igniting the damn atmosphere. But it's still dangerous to a certain degree. And honestly, any weapon is dangerous to a certain degree. Even something like a knife. Knife isn't even shooting anything, but if you're being an idiot, you can probably cut or even stab yourself with your own knife. It's a weapon. It is inherently dangerous. It just so happens that one will blow you into tiny chunks, the other will permanently fuck up a planet. Different levels of risk. After that, you have things like your standard grenades. They have pulse mines, which are relatively interesting but infrequently used thing. It's more so something that a lot of specialists will have, especially specialists that are specifically set up to do things like ambushes. Pulse mines are non-lethal. Unless, I mean, I guess it's about as lethal as that one meme YouTube video of somebody putting a traffic cone on top of a airbag and then firing the airbag, which is awesome, by the way. If you've never seen that, the traffic cone goes flying. It's great. But, they're dangerous technically, but they're designed to be non-lethal. And what they do is it's a massive pulse shockwave that erupts from the top of the pulse mine. And the primary purpose of these is used by specialists to quite literally put it in the middle of a road and like something like a tank drives over it and it just flips the fucking tank. And obviously in that type of situation, that's very bad for the pilot, or I guess in this case, the driver of the tank. But potentially really advantageous to you. And that's largely what pulse mines are for. Now, technically, your standard soldier will be equipped with pulse mines in those rare types of situations where there might not be a specialist, but you very quickly need to deal with a vehicle. What better way to deal with a vehicle than to turtle the damn thing? At that point, it's not really a threat anymore. They have things like plasma-based grenades as well as plasmite grenades, which are very dangerous but have a very high yield. They're essentially similar to demolition charges. They can do a lot of damage in a very short amount of time because it's literally just, I guess grenade really isn't the right word. It's kind of like a satchel charge, but smaller than a satchel charge. So they can literally just take it in their hand and fucking wing it across the battlefield. And it causes essentially like a demolition charge level blast. It will do some serious damage to the area around it. And it's fantastic because it's a cheap alternative that doesn't require specialists for situations in which you need to take down a building. The enemies are bunkered down in this building. You can't really get them out by just sending in somebody and shooting them out because their position is that well fortified. Set down a couple of these plasmite charges and all of a sudden, no more building, no more dudes in the building, And again, like I said, it doesn't require specialists to set up. You don't need a demolitionist to come in and set up these explosives because chances are, unless they're actively with you already, this is going to take far too much time and they're going to become far too much of a problem. They do have standard grenades, as we talked about in the past. The majority of Shattered Legacies is energy based. It's a lot of energy weapons, and as a result, more kinetic and I guess explosives are still used, but more kinetic things like bullets aren't really used. So as a result, the armor is largely designed to defend against, energy weapons. And as a result, they don't have armor that is typically strong enough to handle something even like your average size caliber, like a 5.56 or a 7.62. The majority of armor won't be able to handle that. Now, technically the flak armor of your standard soldier will be able to handle that, but it's not as protective or as durable as, say, like a ballistics vest that the military would actually use. It's capable of stopping that caliber, but if you're being shot at by multiple bullets, it's not going to keep up. But of course, again, almost everybody uses energy weapons, so it makes sense that they don't really need that physical protection. And as a result, because everybody is so focused on either shields or energy defense, whilst explosives are used and are fairly commonplace, like standard soldiers within the Cyratin Royal Army, they have just normal fragmentation grenades. That's the thing that they have. That's the thing that they use. But again, it's one of those situations where there's not really a great way of dealing with explosives. Obviously, yes, in the modern military, we do have various different equipment that can probably deal with explosives, but by and large, not really, you know. And it's very much the same way within the Cyratin Empire. Or not the Cyratin Empire, but other factions within Shattered Legacies, you know. Technically, do they have equipment that are capable of withstanding something like a grenade? Yes. Are they actually going to use it? Probably not, simply because, yes, there are grenades on the battlefield, but it's not like they're carpet bombing the area with grenades, you know? They might have some armor that is capable of withstanding blasts at a relatively decent level, but it's not going to be equipment that is specialized towards it, because then they'd have significantly weaker energy-based armor, which is significantly more important. Now, let's get into some of the specialists, as there are quite a few. Now, obviously, some of them you can probably imagine. There are snipers, there are demolitionists, you know, there are heavy gunners, or machine gunners, I guess, you know. There are a lot of different specializations. And as a result, this is one of the reasons why the Cyratin Empire uses plasmite weaponry, because it's very modular, you know. A plasmite weapon, with the exception of something like a plasmite sidearm, it's always the exact same core component. You know, you have what is essentially the magazine, the way that the energy is put into the weapon itself. You have what is essentially the firing chamber, which isn't technically a firing chamber because they don't need a firing pin, because it's not a kinetic weapon. It's an energy weapon. So you kind of have to think of, take a modern weapon and then turn it into an energy gun. You know? So that main area that deals with the actual firing of the bullet, that's the same. But things like, it's like energy weapons in Fallout. You know, you can change out the barrel. So now suddenly it's either a semi-automatic that it can go to full automatic, or it could be a shotgun, or it could be a marksman's rifle. You know, it's very modular. You have the same core component that is responsible for taking energy from the power pack, which is essentially the equivalent of a magazine, and then the firing chamber itself, which is whatever the energy equivalent would be. You have that core component, but then you can change the barrel, you can change the stock, you can change the handle, you can change the attachments. They're incredibly modular, and as a result, they're capable of doing an incredible amount of various different things. So it's like, you can literally have, let's say, a member of the Cyratin Royal Army that specializes in sniping. And so he'll have a barrel on it, attachments, stock, whatever it is, specifically tailored towards being a sniper. But let's say that an enemy is coming, he can very quickly, and most likely has it on him, swap out those components and various different parts of the weapon and turn that sniper rifle into a shotgun that he can use at very close quarters, because typically snipers will be inside of most likely a building. You know, when we're talking about urban combat, if we're talking about rural, they'll probably change into something maybe like a carbine or a marksman's rifle or something like that. You know, something that's a little bit more easy to use at mid to close range rather than a shotgun. But it's still that very same thing, you know. They just have to have the components. They don't have to have a completely different gun, because again, the firing chamber is still the exact same thing, no matter what configuration you're using. Like I said, it could be a marksman's rifle, it could be a shotgun, it could be a machine gun, it could be a carbine, so on and so forth. The possibilities are endless. It's so long as you have the equipment on you. And oftentimes this equipment, very compact, very lightweight. Like, there are certain operatives within the Cyratin Royal Army that are literally outfitted with 3, maybe even 4 different variants of weapons that they can constantly swap in and out as need be as they're doing their operations. Now, typically, these are more of your, like, special forces types of guys, but regardless, they are very lightweight, they're very compact, they're very small. You can put them on something like a plate carrier, and it's not bulky, it's not in the way. You know, it's very small. You can put it in a pouch. You can pull it out, attach it, do whatever you need to do, take it off, put it back in the pouch, hands-free, out of the way, no matter what you're doing. They're designed to be this way. And it's one of the reasons why, aside from humanity, which is far too prideful to use anything else, like the Barramon and Bastilians will go to very large lengths to acquire plasmite weaponry because it's so modular, because it's so high performance. You know, like when we're talking about different generations of weapons, plasmite weaponry doesn't really get any modifications. You know, it might be a tiny, minuscule tweak to energy efficiency, but that's it. They're not really adding anything new because the design of a plasmite rifle is already about as close to perfect as you can get. You know, it's just these tiny, minuscule optimizations that in the grand scheme of things don't really matter. You know? And so, as a result, specialists, while being oftentimes trained in whatever they are specialized in, it's still the exact same equipment. So like that analogy I used before, the sniper is sniping with this plasmite marksman's rifle or sniper rifle or whatever the hell it is. Enemies are coming up on him. He can literally just swap out the barrel alone and now all of a sudden have a machine gun that he can just light the enemy or ambushers up and then swap right back to a sniper rifle. You know, he doesn't need to pull out another weapon. Now, technically, yes, it's still kind of the same process because you're removing the barrel, which is still very simple to do, putting it away, grabbing a new one, and then attaching it. You know, it takes time, but it's far easier to do than, say, carrying a rifle with you. You know, you have your sniper rifle, but then you also have your assault rifle, which I don't think actual snipers would ever do. They probably stick to their sidearm. You know, the old COD build. You know, you have your sniper rifle, and then you have some pistol, oftentimes an auto pistol, to deal with anybody who's getting too close, you know? Because, again, if you want the long-range power of a sniper rifle, but you also want to be able to engage at medium to short range, you have to have that other weapon. And oftentimes that weapon is bulky. It might get in the way. It might make things uncomfortable for your body. You know, it causes more problems. And that's why the Cyratin Empire invested so much into these modular plasmite weapons. Unfortunately, due to the energies that we're dealing with, Solstite is not modular. And as a result, Solstite weapons are oftentimes tailor-made to their specialist. So if it's a sniper rifle that is based off of Solstite, that's all it can be. And in those rare situations, which granted, we're talking about Solstite here. It's literally the sun taken into the size of a marble and then shot at somebody. It really doesn't matter at that point. You know, one shot is pretty much a guaranteed kill. Like, even if it just grazes them, it'll probably vaporize whatever the hell is touching, whatever it grazes. And at that point, you're basically out of commission. But so, the Cyratin Empire utilizes multiple different specialists. Obviously, you have your snipers, you have things like medics, you have engineers, you have machine gunners, you have demolitions experts, you have all these various different individuals that specialize in various different methods of war, and then they're complemented by the main backbone of the Cyratin Royal Army itself. Now, whilst I said earlier on that the Cyratin Empire primarily focuses on infantry in the Navy, like I said, they're no strangers to weaponized vehicles like tanks and things like that. It's just they don't have a very big focus on them. So as a result, when you're fighting the Cyratin Empire, it's largely going to be a lot of soldiers on the ground, which already presents an incredible amount of problems, because whilst technically they won't have the quote-unquote heavy firepower of a tank on their side, there's a lot of fucking dudes. Especially if we're talking about an urban environment. There are a lot of fucking dudes. These guys have very good training, they have very good equipment, and at that point, it's very difficult to deal with the Cyratin Empire. Now, if we're talking about a rural setting, the Cyratin Empire kind of struggles a little bit because, like I said, they don't have that emphasis on war vehicles. Obviously, like I've said before, they have their war machines, but they're only capable of doing so much. They have tanks, but they're not really super focused on refining the tanks as much as they are with the equipment on their infantry. It's a very stupid way of organizing your military, and I'm fully aware of that, but it kind of gives them this little hint of different, Like, it's this ever so slight, it's what we're used to when it comes to armies, but it's just ever so slightly alien, because they have such a heavy focus on the Navy and the infantry, and basically don't really care about armored units and atmospheric aircraft. It's largely the majority of battles will be fought with soldiers on the ground complemented by artillery. And that's largely it. Not every once in a while, you'll still see war vehicles, but it's not as much as, say, a faction like Humanity that has a heavy focus on war vehicles rather than infantry. There's going to be a lot of war vehicles out there, but the difference is that the Cyratin Empire have focused so much on their infantry that not only do they have the Cyratin Marines, which in of themselves are walking tanks, but even if you don't have a specialist, oftentimes Cyratin Royal Army soldiers will have anti-tank capabilities, whether that be the plasmite charge that they have that is normally designed to be used on buildings, but if you have a really good throwing arm and you get particularly creative, you can probably use that thing to take out a tank. I'm not gonna lie. Like, it's powerful. It's a very powerful, because like I said, it's designed as like a satchel charge. It's designed to do a lot of damage in a relatively confined area. So if you manage to get a good angle, and let's say you have some sort of substance that makes the thing stick to the tank, and you manage to throw it at maybe like the ass of a tank, it's probably going to destroy the tank, because the plasmite charge is strong enough at that point, because typically tanks are, not always, but typically they're lighter armor on the back. So, after that, we can get into more elite forces. And this is where we start seeing the actual exosuits. Up until now, even those specialists, they still have flak armor or flak equivalent armor, depending on what they are. Like a machine gunner, their armor is probably going to be a little bit thicker. Something like a marksman or a sniper, probably the flak armor is going to be a bit thinner. That way it's not nearly as heavy, which again, they have exoskeletons on, so that weight is pretty much negated anyway. But it makes them just a little bit more agile, less bulky, easier to kind of blend in and hide. But when we start getting to our special forces, we start seeing the actual exosuits. Now, keep in mind that the Cyratin Marines and Cyratin Marauders, they're not counted as being part of the Cyratin Royal Army. They're counted as their own individual branch of the military. They're counted as the Cyratin... What the hell was the exact terminology? Cyratin Super Soldiers. I think I originally called them the Cyratin Special Forces, but regardless. So, these two aren't included. These are oftentimes soldiers that may have received genetic or cybernetic augmentation. Usually it's fairly minor. It's nowhere near as extensive as, say, actual proper super soldiers within the Cyratin Empire, but it's enough to give them an edge. They're given exosuits, which again are exoskeletons that basically have armor plates attached to them to create like a suit of armor. It still has the the same benefits of just a basic exoskeleton. It's a little bit heavier, but now you have actual armor protecting you. Not only that, but again, unlike power armor, it doesn't impede your movement. So you have, I suppose, technically close to heavy armor that doesn't impede your range of movement while still providing you with the same benefits of an exoskeleton. That's why the Cyratin Empire loves using exosuits. But so, these are typically your operatives that you'll see a lot of Solstite equipment on. You know, they'll oftentimes have Solstite carbines. They're usually semi-automatic that have a trigger group that can change it to full automatic and stuff like that. But if they want to swap out to something like a sniper rifle or a shotgun, for example, they'll need to actually bring the weapon. Now, most of these soldiers have exosuits. Flak armor itself isn't made of corrodium. I actually haven't given them an official substance yet, but flak armor isn't corrodium, which means it doesn't have the same insane defensive capabilities as corrodium. However, these special operatives that are using the exosuits, they do have proper corrodium armor on them. Now, what is this corrodium armor? It's usually probably something like 1/8 inch armor plates, which for infantry is incredibly good. In fact, I think 1/8 armor plate was the same as Cyratin Marines. You know, exosuits are designed for high durability without sacrificing mobility. And as a result, power armor oftentimes have even thicker armor plates than 1/8. You know, maybe it's 3/8 armor plating or something like that. You know, it's significantly more durable. In the grand scheme of things, is there going to be a lot of stuff that can penetrate through this thickness of corrodium? No, not really. You know, plasma, it'll take plasma a significant amount of time, especially if you're talking about proper power armor at 3/8 quarter inch. Or 3/8 inch, not 3/8 quarter. That's an idiot. But, you know, it's going to take plasma a long time to get through that. If we're talking about 1/8, it's still going to take a while. It'll be significantly faster, but chances are whoever's shooting at you with the plasma weapon is probably going to end up dead before they can actually core their way through that level of armor. So, we can now get to the structure of how the Cyratin Royal Army kind of organizes itself in terms of actual ranks. So obviously you have your common soldier, which are simply known as the Cyratin Legionaries. And which I suppose I should have been using this whole time, but regardless. Cyratin Legionaries are basically like your bog standard boots on the ground soldier, you know. This also includes your specialists and stuff like that. And it's basically just your common soldier. After that, you have Cyratin officers, sometimes called corporals. Now, corporal is an actual military rank, but regardless, Cyratin officers are oftentimes like squad leaders. You know, they're not in charge of anything particularly large within the Cyratin military, but they're people who have enough knowledge and enough natural leadership to command their own squad. And it's similar to Warhammer 40k and Astartes. You know, the company captains. They're expected to follow orders, but they're also expected that any situation that they encounter, they can problem solve it and deal with it themselves. You know, they don't require the orders of their superior to get through various different situations. And Cyratin officers are much in the same way. Now, beyond that, we have Cyratin captains. And this is oftentimes individuals that are in charge of a battalion or multiple battalions within the Cyratin Royal Army. After that, you have what is known as a Cyratin High Captain. And oftentimes this is a High Captain is in charge of an entire company or division. You know, a battalion can be upwards of maybe 200 to 400 soldiers, whereas a division or company can be all the way up to thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of soldiers. Beyond the High Captain are the Cyratin commanders themselves, and we've talked about the commanders before. There are 4 Cyratin commanders. Each one is in charge of one of the technically 3 branches of the Cyratin military. One's in charge of the Royal Cyratin Army, one is in charge of the Navy, which by association also includes the Air Force, one is in charge of super soldiers, and then one is in charge of whatever other might entail in that specific moment, whether that be armored divisions, Cyratin war machines, or even the rare situations where the Cyratin Mages Corps, i.e. the natural disasters, actually need a commander giving them orders, which typically they don't. And that's largely the structure. And then obviously beyond the Cyratin commanders, we have the High Cyratin Commander, which is basically a middleman between the top brass and the commanders themselves. And then the commanders divvy up their orders to all of the high captains, then it goes to the captains, and then to the officers as the squad leaders. And obviously, at the very top of the pecking order, you have the Cyratin Supreme Commander, who is in charge of all facets of the Cyratin military. So, whilst there's probably still a lot more that we could talk about, that's probably where I'm going to leave it. Like a lot of these deep dives, it's more of a general idea of the faction or the concept that we're talking about, unless it's a deep dive about a specific character, largely because we want to get a broad scope of what this faction or what this part of Shattered Legacies is capable of, and then as the relevant information, because obviously there's more information, as that specific bit of information pertains to whatever we're talking about, that's when we're kind of going to bring it up. For example, in the last episode, I talked about the Vortex Cannon and how the Cyratin Empire deals with Blight Plague and the Null Void. Technically, yeah, that's information that I could have done in their deep dives, but it pertained to that specific episode, so I brought it up then. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. I do apologize again for this video being late, as it is, but I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys are looking forward to most likely Saturday and Sunday's live streams. I didn't do last Saturday and Sunday because I was not feeling like it. But I'll probably end up doing the streams. I need to get back into my schedule. That being Saturday, noon Central Standard Time, where we're doing RimWorld, and Sunday, noon Central Standard Time, where we are doing Sunday Night Live, where I pick a random game and we just play it for 2 hours. And then right back here next Tuesday, so long as I don't forget again, with Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. And then I'm probably going to end up starting up a new series next Wednesday and Friday. I still do not understand why I cannot upload the Minecraft videos. And I've tried even mod packs that aren't the one that I'm using right now. They just don't work. It's the weirdest thing ever because I cannot find anything about it. It just will not upload. So whatever. We'll probably move on. We'll come back to Modded Survival Season 2 at some point, similar to our 7 Days to Die series. The 7 Days to Die, there wasn't a lot of activities, so I'm kind of postponing that. I'm obviously having issues with the Modded Survival, whatever the hell is going on there. So we're probably going to start up another series. It seems to have something to do with Minecraft. It literally makes absolutely no sense, but whatever. So we're probably going to go to a completely different game. We'll do a shorter series on that, and then we'll come back and see if I can't get the damn thing to upload again. So until then, guys, see ya.